Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Edward Cahill.
Hi there. How are you doing today?
Very well, thanks. Glad to be here.
I'm so glad to have you. Can you tell me a little bit about your writing?
Well, I used to write literary history, and for some time now I've been writing strictly fiction. And my novel, Disorderly Men, just out in September, concerns three men who are arrested in the police raid of a gay bar in Greenwich Village in 1962. And it follows their lives for a few weeks as they confront not only the forces that oppress them, but also the forces that keep them living dishonest lives.
That sounds so fascinating. So what inspired that idea of having these three characters like be found in this gay bar and all of that?
Well, I'm really interested in deep character, but I also like complex plot. And if you think about the coming out story, it sounds like it's something we're really familiar with, but the coming out story is really a sort of an existential trial. If you believe that the truth of who you are might get you killed, then you've got a real adventure on your hands. And so I was really interested in seeing how different characters from different walks of life with different resources would manage this challenge. The police raid suddenly brings a lot of conflict into their lives, and they have to decide how they're going to resolve those conflicts, how they're going to navigate them, and not only survive, but also find a little bit of dignity. It's 1962. It's a time where dignity for gay people is pretty scarce. My character Danny works at a grocery store, and he's just been kicked out of his home by his family, so he has very little to lose. But my character Roger is a banker with a family. He lives in Westchester. He's done really well for himself, but he's got a big dark secret. Mm-hmm. My character Julian has a prestigious job teaching at Columbia University. He's got a lot to lose as well. And so once they've been arrested, and they realize that it's quite likely that their secret is going to be out, they have to decide what they're going to do. So many gay stories of the past have involved gays being victims, really sort of constructed as too weak to respond to the forces that oppress them. And I really wanted a story where the men decide to take their fate into their own hands and not only fight back and fight for themselves because they decide that they are worth it, but also really confront their own demons, confront the feelings of fear and self-loathing that have kept them from living fuller lives.
That is so incredible. And I love that you're giving these characters the agency to make those choices. Because I mean, especially with stories in the past and stuff, even still today, we get a lot where it's like the bury your gays trope, or things are all queer baited, and it's like all different things to remove agency and choice from queer stories. So that's a big deal that's involved in this.
I think in 1962, queer people did not have a lot of resources. They did not have a lot of information. So it was a very scary time to try to act on one's own agency, which meant you had to be very smart about it. You had to be clever and secretive. And to me, that just makes for a really good story. So their stories represent a lot of historical pain, for sure, but I think a lot of historical ingenuity and courage, and just real determination against all odds to try to find a little bit of dignity where there isn't much.
Mm-hmm. What was your research process like for this book?
Well, it was both formal and completely informal. I read a lot of books published in and around 1962 when the story takes place. I watched a lot of movies, and there's a kind of the classic melodrama of Douglas Sirk just kind of looms large in this story. So a lot of it was images that I have of 1962. I wanted it to feel like 1962. Of course, I'm a literary historian by training, so I wanted to make sure that all of my actual history was impeccable. So far, I think I've done a pretty good job with that. there's it's very, very recent history. I was only born 5 years later, so it's not ancient history. There's so many resources. Of course, as any novelist will tell you, the internet is just the easiest resource in the world. If you want to know where your character would have gotten on the subway in 1962 in the Bronx, you can find that out in a matter of seconds. So I did a lot, but a lot of what I was really aiming for was the feeling of 1962, to capture that in the prose, to capture that in the details, and to make sure that my research never appeared to be research, which I feel like is the great sin of historical fiction.
And it's the hardest part with any writing, especially historical fiction, is balancing that research with story, where it's like, I want to share this cool fact with you, but I need to find out how to package it properly.
That's right. Yeah, it has to come from the motivation of the character's feelings, interiority, some central part of the plot. If it's window dressing, readers smell that a mile away, and they usually don't like it.
Mm-hmm. So, has your background as a literary historian, as a teacher, impacted your writing in it?
Oh, hugely. Yeah. Like I said, I've been writing literary history for over 20 years. But I was on sabbatical at the New York Public Library, working on a big project about the cultural history of social mobility in the early modern Atlantic world. And I was halfway through it, and I just decided, no, what I really want to do is write a novel. So I pushed the books away, got some new ones, started reading, started writing. In fact, at first, Disorderly Man was going to be a screenplay. But once I started understanding who these characters were, I realized I needed different POVs. I needed to really understand what their struggles felt like, and couldn't do it all in a 100-page script, and couldn't do it all without the kind of interiority that's possible with a third-person close narrator.
That makes complete sense. Yeah.
But the other thing, as a scholar, I wrote a dissertation, or I wrote a first book. I've written many articles. These projects involve managing lots and lots of information. And any novelist will tell you that one of the hardest parts about writing a novel is just managing so much information. Every character has so many details and traits and so many tics, and every character goes through, space and time in ways that have to make sense, and you have to keep track of absolutely everything. And if you've done a big project before, then you find writing a novel not so daunting. I think if you've never done such a big project, you sit down to try to write a novel, and it really just becomes overwhelming. We're often at that moment where we don't even know if we can do this. But if we've done it before, then we think, all right, it feels like I can't do this, but I can. And I think the other thing is, I've taught probably over 100 novels in the classroom. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about what works and what doesn't, about what plot looks like, about what, how characters emerge on the page, the kinds of details that work or don't work, the way the very best writers kind of teach us how to read their novel. And so I think I've just learned a lot of really important lessons from my favorite writers, from Jane Austen and James Baldwin to Toni Morrison and a whole bunch of contemporary writers.
That is so cool. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I'm curious to know more about how you started writing, when you started writing in your life.
I was a recent college graduate working for a congressman, hating my job and writing short stories instead of doing my work. And when I realized that eventually I would have to quit, I quit my job and I started waiting tables, and I wrote short stories and I sent them to the New Yorker, and they were rejected, and I was very surprised. So I went to grad school because that seemed like a safer bet. But I had written plays, and with my partner at the time, wrote a number of screenplays, really started thinking pretty seriously about what story was, how story worked, how characters worked. And so then it was really in that pivotal moment in the New York Public Library when I decided I was going to try to write a novel, and I didn't know that I could do it. But I approached it with the philosophy that, one, it never had to be good, and two, I just had to keep going. And with those two rules, I found myself writing a novel, and chapter after chapter, it began to come together, and I learned a lot. I learned a ton. It took me 4 years to write the novel. but also 4 years to learn how to write a novel. Because every chapter was a new lesson in how point of view works and how plot works, and what's the relationship between plot and story, and what are the kinds of details that are gonna be noticed by one character but not another character. Took me a long time to do that. 4 years drafting it. Took me a year to find an agent. It took the agent 2 years to sell the book, and then it was another year to get it into press. So it was a long journey, but a really exciting one. And really, at no point did I ever find myself, suffering writer's block. Or I wish it had sold faster. But the process itself was just so much fun. And I think what I learned in that time is that I just absolutely love fiction. I'm trained as a literary historian. I just took on a new graduate student, but really my heart is in fiction, and I think that's what I'm going to keep doing.
That is absolutely fantastic. Well, now I'm curious how getting started in writing short stories and screenplays has influenced the way that you now write novels. Because I know that can be very different, where some people start in poetry, or some people, like, there's a lot of different places that you can come at writing a novel. And how does that angle influence you at all?
I mean, I think writing screenplays helped me a lot, because it really helped me understand. First of all, I was a terrible short story writer. When I was younger, I thought if you could write beautiful sentences, then they would all somehow add up to a beautiful story. And I was wrong. I was wrong about that. Beautiful sentences do not make a beautiful story. You have to have a story. The story has to have an arc. You have to have characters with motivations, and they need to have a perspective, and that perspective needs to be embodied in the world. I didn't know any of that. Writing screenplays, I think, really helped me to see that, how to make a story move, how to use the tiniest details to uncover some aspect of a character's personality, and above all, how to write dialogue. Screenplays are mostly dialogue, although certainly not all dialogue, and that dialogue needs to be realistic, but it also needs to do an awful lot of work. And novels involve a lot of dialogue too, and again, it needs to sound realistic without necessarily being realistic. So it was really good training. I think screenplays really taught me how to set scenes, how to make scenes work, when to start the scene, when to end the scene, and how to keep it moving, and how to keep it doing multiple things at the same time rather than just one thing. I'd say screenplays also really taught me how to make a story visual, how to create an environment that a reader can imagine, can really see, so that when they're lost in that fictional trance, they're not just lost in ideas, but they're lost in images, and that we can kind of keep them moving through that world of images while they stay in that trance.
Oh yeah, and that's so important for grounding a story. And it's like what you were just saying about how you can write beautiful sentences, but you also have to have a plot and images and that setting to take it to the next level. Now, what kinds of stories do you find that you're drawn towards, both when you're creating things or when you're reading or watching things?
I like really interesting, complicated, experimental stories. But in the end, the stories that Forster said only connect. And it's stories about connection, about human connection, about people struggling to connect. I think that are the ones that are most compelling to me. I think that stories about people trying to find dignity in their lives against all the forces that would keep them from that dignity. Really just sort of two very basic things, right? We want to live good lives, and we want to be connected to other people. And yet the world that we live in makes that so very difficult. And so if that's what we want, if that's our goal, and often it's an unconscious goal, right? We might have a character that has some more objective goal. In the pursuit of that objective goal, they really discover that what they really want to do is to connect. And it's those moments, right? Those moments where the character finds their dignity or finds that connection. Those are the moments that make us weep, that make us smile, that make us laugh. that's when we say, oh gosh, I love this novel. These are the kinds of novels that I want to read. Novels can do so many things. They can teach us about the world. They can make us ask difficult questions about how to live and what to do. But I think in the end, what keeps us turning the page is pleasure. And that pleasure can take many forms. But for me, it really it's the pleasure of that discovery of connection, that discovery of dignity.
That's incredible. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So, I kind of pivoting back to this book. Where did you start with the writing process? Did you start with an outline or did you just go straight into it? Did you start in the middle of the book? Where was it?
Well, so the novel begins with a police raid on a gay bar. And I knew that everything was going to emanate from that moment. This was a kind of inciting incident, as we say in screenwriting, that was going to get the story going. But in the case of my three protagonists, it was also the thing that was going to change everything in their lives. And so I knew I was going to start there, and I didn't have a plot yet. But I knew that I wanted it to be a plot in which, faced with this problem, each of these three men, in their own way, decided to fight back. And I also knew that they were going to fight back in some way together. They were going to find each other and fight back together. And it doesn't turn out to be, entirely neat that way. They don't team up and become, the team of queer heroes, fighting.
No, I would also read that book.
Okay,
I would read both books.
I might write that book next time. So I knew that's where I wanted the plot to go, but I hadn't really figured out any of the details. So I just wrote the first 6 chapters, where they are in the bar. There's the raid. They get arrested. They go to the police station, and then they go home. And at that point, I felt like I knew them enough, having kind of lived with them, and I saw the way they reacted, and each one reacted in a very different way, and what happens to them in the process of getting arrested and spending the night in the police station affects them in different ways. Once I knew who they were, then I could begin to outline the rest of the story. And for each character, it goes in very, very different ways. One ends up searching for a lover who disappears that night. Another is brutally beaten and is determined on revenge. And then another is facing blackmail and the destruction of his whole life and everything that he values. So they're each facing this existential conflict, and each one decides in one way or another that they are worth fighting for, that their lives are worth fighting for, and that means, like I said, it means fighting their antagonist, which may be the police, the criminal justice system, homophobia, but it also means confronting themselves and who they are and how they live and what they believe and whether or not they're going to continue living dishonest lives.
That is so interesting. Thank you. Yeah. So, what are some things that you do to get into the proper headspace when you're writing? Like some of the more tangible things. Do you have a certain playlist, or what do you do?
I'm a terribly inconsistent writer. I will go 2 or 3 weeks without writing a word. Because I teach, sometimes I just get bogged down with papers. I get bogged down with life. But when I get that little opening, I like to just push everything aside. I put my phone on focus. I make lots of coffee, and then I will write for hours and hours and hours. So I know that my creativity comes in spurts. I like to sometimes I start writing, at 10 o'clock at night, and I will just go all night long because that's when it's happening. So when I'm feeling motivated, that's when I do it. But I don't always know when I'm going to feel motivated. Sometimes if I'm traveling, I find myself in a hotel. It's one of the best places to write because, if I don't know anybody, then no one's going to bother me. I don't listen to music. I want absolute quiet because my head is so noisy with characters and ideas. So really, just the fewer distractions, the better.
I have to say, I fully understand you about loving writing in hotels. I love hotels, on the go, wherever's a strange place to write is a good place to write for me. It's yes. And
I write in cafes all the time. I have 3 cafes near my apartment, and I just sort of alternate. And I actually do listen to music in the cafe because I can't stand hearing anybody else talking while I'm writing. But I play some of the dullest, most boring music because all I want really is that kind of background noise, so that I can focus and sort of enter into the dream of my story.
Hmm. That's so cool. Yeah. So, what interested you in writing historical fiction specifically? We've already talked a little bit about how the story came to be.
Well, I'm a historian, and I used to work on the 18th century, and so uh, you know uh, people talk differently in the 18th century. They use different language. They use old-fashioned language, as we might say. And I've been an anachronism ever since I was a little kid. And the other kids teased me about it, and my mother made funny little jokes about it. But I always kind of fancied myself, from another time. And so when I write, I find that contemporary language just feels a little awkward for me. I've tried contemporary short stories or short stories set, in our own historical moment, and I'm just never quite as comfortable as when I'm somehow set back in the past. 1962 made the perfect sense for me because it was 7 years before Stonewall. The 60s hadn't really yet begun, and I wanted to be right on the cusp of social revolution. But I really wanted to be in the mid-century, and I wanted to write in that mid-century style, the kind of Richard Yates, John Cheever style, which I just absolutely adore. On the other hand, the novel that I'm working on right now takes place in the early 18th century. I didn't plan to do it; it just kind of found me, and so the idiom there is even more archaic, and I find ways to make that readable and enjoyable. Not everybody necessarily wants to read 250 pages of Augustan prose, but that way of being sort of playful with the power of language, of speaking with wit, and bringing some erudition to one's speech. It's always been just sort of instinctive with me, and so I like characters who are also very, very playful with language. And I've just found that it's easier for me to do that by setting my stories in the past.
That is such an interesting perspective on it. Because I've heard a lot of people talk about writing historical fiction and read a lot of historical fiction. A lot of times people do it for a mood or an atmosphere because it was around one central historical event. But I love the idea that it's kind of matching the way that you already talk and the way that you kind of live in the world.
Yeah, I would like to write. I would like to write a novel that is set in 2023, and I will try. I'm just not quite there yet. I think the world changes so quickly now, and just when I think I've got my head wrapped around something, it's changed. And the wonderful thing about the past is it's been there for a long time, and we know an awful lot about it. And there's many books have been written about the early 18th century or 1962. There's so many ways that we can get at it. It feels like it's not exactly not dynamic, but it's still enough that I can think of it. I can think about it artistically, and I find that just so much harder to do with our own historical moment.
Well, I think that sometimes with the way the world is moving right now, things can feel out of date so much faster. So if you write a book about 2023 and our world now, and it gets published in 2024, people are going to read it and go, what is he talking about?
That's
That's
right.
not around. What and it'll feel dated at times, depending on what references you use.
That's right. In my class called How Fiction Works, we just finished Jennifer Egan's A Visit from the Goon Squad. And if you know that novel, in the final chapter of the novel, the characters were just set in the near future, and the characters walk around with things called handsets. Now, this novel was published in 2010, and obviously, what Egan is sort of gesturing to is the idea of smartphones. Well, now we have smartphones, and the idea of handsets seems, a little silly. but it's such a good novel, it doesn't matter. But it does give you that sense, even if you're sort of projecting into the future, if it's only into the near future, you can seem a little outdated by the time that story is actually out there because we're moving so quickly.
Mm-hmm. For sure. For sure. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. This has been I've had such a fantastic time talking to you and hearing all about your novel. This was great.
I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Before we finish up, I just have one last question, and that is, what do you have coming up?
What do I have coming up? Well, I'm going to be reading at Beacon Books and Cafe in March, in February, and in March I'm going to be at the Tennessee Williams Festival and the Saints and Sinners Festival in New Orleans. And meanwhile, I'm working on this new novel I mentioned that takes place in the early 18th century. And what I can tell you at this point is that it involves young Benjamin Franklin, a lot of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's not as gay as my first novel, Disorderly Men, but it's still pretty gay.
Fun. I cannot wait to read it. It sounds fantastic. Anyone listening to this, please go get Disorderly Men, and then this next book, once it comes out, we can hear about the somewhat gay Benjamin Franklin book, because I'm so down for it already. And yeah, just support Edward Cahill. Thank you again for coming on the show.
It was my pleasure. Thanks, Molly.
For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
I'm Edward Cahill.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after. The end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects, and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.